Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me, Dr. Ross Tapsell from Australian National University's Malaysia Institute. Now, I want to touch a little bit about the Anti-Fake News Act or law, as you pointed out a little bit earlier. It's been repealed, so kudos to the current government for doing that. However, now there's, I perhaps talk about another type of law to take a look at false information. But currently, the Malaysian Media Council has just elected its pro tem committee. Now, social media would fall under them, right? Any abuses in social media, would that fall under the Media Council?
I presume not.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you could describe more, but usually a media council is looking at mainstream media work,
at journalists,
and then we think elsewhere about social media.
So where would the misuse of social media, for instance, fall under? For Malaysia, it will be under the MCMC, but do you think there needs to be perhaps laws that look at this, regulation that looks at abuse of social media?
There's certainly pressure, I think, on the government and the minister to do something in this space and create some kind of either regulation or commission or overarching body. And I can understand that, especially given we've just discussed some of these disinformation practices that are rising. Unfortunately, when new laws have been created, first in Malaysia, now repealed, but also elsewhere in Southeast Asia, we've seen them being politicised or in some cases abused, and in some cases cracked down on individual citizens who share material that they either didn't know was fake because they're very uneducated, or really is cracking down on one or two specific individuals, really how a society should work. And so there's questions around whether a regulation is a good thing. So the big question is, how do you try to reduce disinformation without bringing in a draconian law? And Malaysian government, I think, understands that. I think the Minister of Communication and others understand that they don't want to bring in a draconian law as we're seeing in other parts of Southeast Asia. So the question is, well, then what does need to be sort of cracked down upon? And I think the important thing here is that cracking down on syndicates, business companies, groups who are paid and are creating this stuff for a profit, rather than individuals who are sharing material just on their own social media pages, is a better way to try to crack down on some of this disinformation practices.
So we know in Singapore that there is this law that's being used, and I'm wondering, so we've got Singapore as an example. Are there any other examples of, say, countries who are perhaps getting it right on the regulation front?
Getting it right.
Getting it right.
Yeah.
So we've got Singapore as an example of how you can have draconian regulation.
Yeah.
What examples should we be looking at if we were looking to model? For a model.
Yeah, Germany and France, the Europeans are trying to have a model where they're looking to fine platforms and trying to put the responsibility back onto the platforms. Okay. And I think that's something worth thinking about, to try to say to Facebook and Twitter, you guys need to do this better, otherwise we will fine you. And from my interviews with disinformation producers in Southeast Asia, what scares them most is actually platform takedowns. So yes, there's fact checkers, but they're more worried about the fact that Facebook takes down all the pages they've created or names them as bad actors, or as Facebook likes to call it, inauthentic behaviour. So, this is what the responsibility, I think, does need to fall back on the platforms, but perhaps government can work harder in making that happen.
So explain a little bit about that. So the biggest fear is that these platforms would act on them. How would Facebook and Google, for instance, act on these so-called bad actors? How do they identify these bad actors?
Right, so they identify it through inauthentic behaviour, which is usually they're creating fake Facebook accounts, they're creating networks which pump out the same kind of material, or social media pages that are just copying and pasting stuff in the same news sites, for example, throughout the Malaysian media or on individual politicians' pages. So it's the inauthentic behaviour that they're cracking down on. In Twitter, this can mean bots and trolls. But unfortunately, a lot of this stuff has been exposed by researchers themselves, including international and local researchers. Okay. And the responsibility needs to be more adopted by Twitter and Facebook and Google, because they're the ones that have the genius computer scientists and the billion-dollar companies that can actually take down this inauthentic behaviour. And so they have tried to do this more often in recent times. They've named and shamed bad actors, but I think they need to do much more of it.
I want to talk a little bit about how, you know, the disinformation from, say, those bad actors trickles down into the public consciousness, how it becomes trumpeted perhaps through journalists like myself, through the media, right? So when the media unintentionally reports disinformation and how that becomes, then the message becomes amplified. Has that been the case that you've noticed at all?
Oh, I think there's definite. I mean, one of the best ways to reduce fake news, reduce disinformation, is to just have better quality journalism. If we can again talk about Australia and the fires situation at the moment, the national broadcaster, the ABC, has been lauded by Australian citizens for the excellent reportage and the excellent coverage that they've been doing on the fires. And so there's a lot of trust in the national broadcaster in the ABC. When fires are coming, or when there's hail, or when there's issues to be discussed and events are breaking, people turn to our national public broadcaster because they're seen as reliable journalists and a reliable news site. In Southeast Asia, that's more difficult, right? Trust in the state broadcasters is much lower. They're generally seen to be pro-government or pumping out government messages. Media can be very much tied to ownership, in the case of Indonesia in particular, which means that trust is being reduced.
Sure.
So in order to reduce fake news, you've got to have true news, and people have to believe that news is true. So improving quality journalism is so important.
Is that the first step? Because I'm just wondering, you know, the trust deficit is there undeniably, and how do you bridge that trust deficit if you can't get, say, eyes on pages because the distrust is there?
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? And especially as people move away from mainstream media and go to Facebook pages that they either agree with, or that gets them angry, or it breaches racial and religious echo chambers, as we call them, then that becomes very hard. It's not a simple issue, that's for sure.
All right, okay, let's continue this shortly on Consider This. Don't go anywhere.